All right, it's rolling. So last week I spoke about George Washington, and I said that his three crowning achievements were being the head of the victorious Continental Army, he presided over the Constitutional Convention, and he served as our first president of these United States. Yet Washington lived by the words in Micah 6:8, act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. Washington's focus on service to others and humbly dismissing power at every critical juncture is what made him great. Despite Washington's humble greatness, he might never have become our first president if not for the efforts of a frail, feeble Virginian named James Madison. So today in our America 250, we're going to talk about Madison. Madison was interesting because he was there at so many points along the way, but he was kind of a quiet, soft-spoken person. And so he worked a lot behind the scenes to get things done. And after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, it was no sure thing that the states, 3/4 of them, were going to ratify the new Constitution. The Constitution, or ratification of it, hung in the balance. The great orator Patrick Henry squared off against the Federalist James Madison in Virginia. Now, at the time, Virginia had the largest population in the colonies. They had almost 20% of the population and even more of the wealth. So while technically the Constitution could have been adopted by just 9 of the 13 colonies, the fact that Virginia, New York, and North Carolina, holding almost half the population and more than half the wealth, were holding out, created a massive problem. Because if they didn't go along with this, it would have been kind of failing from the beginning. So that's where the country found itself. Patrick Henry was a great debater, and he ran circles around the mumbling and quiet Madison. In their public debates, Madison had no chance. But luckily, Madison was strong with the pen, and so his Federalist Papers were his way to articulate his messages of what should be done, that there was a need for a strong federal government. And so above the rancor and theater of public debate, Madison's ideas began to gain traction. Patrick Henry and James Madison were at a stalemate in Virginia, with about half the Virginians on each side. So they're living in divided times just as we are now, with half the people lining up on one side and half the people on the other. The thing, though, that they wanted to do back then, they forged a way through. They forged compromise. It was like the end goal was, we're going to get some agreement out of this. Whereas now we get into these ideological bunkers and neither side will budge, and then we just end up kind of siloed in there, starving in our bunkers. But back then they would work out a deal no matter how imperfect. And so they worked out this deal. There was an assurance that a fellow Virginian, George Washington, would be the first president, and that the first Congress, first order of business, would be a Bill of Rights. Because for many, to not have a Bill of Rights, to hand a federal authority power over the people without rights for the individual, felt like the government was going to trample the individual. And so those were the two things they come up with, and Virginia ratified the Constitution. North Carolina and New York soon followed Virginia's lead, and the United States came into existence. Now you would think that was good, right? Everybody lives happily ever after, and that's the end of the story. But it wasn't quite that way. The good thing was, though, unlike many politicians of our time that promise all kinds of things during the campaign or to get something through and then have selective amnesia about what they promised, right? These guys actually followed through, so they got to work on the Bill of Rights. It was the first priority. And so the House adopted 17 amendments initially. The Senate pared that down to 12. So they threw 5 of them out, said, here's 12 amendments that we think should be in the Bill of Rights. Then they sent it to the states, and at the end of 1791, 3/4 of the states had ratified 10 of the 12 amendments. So those 10 amendments became known as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So here they are. The first one had to do, first thing, right out of the gate, freedom of religion. Think about all the things they could have said were most important. Freedom of religion was number one. We're going to get into that more later. Then they talked about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of petition. Second Amendment was the right to keep and bear arms. The third was restricting quartering soldiers in private homes. That's why I talked about with Washington. He refused during his terms as president to stay in people's private residences because he believed the precedent that the British had done that during the earlier times where they put upon the people. We're going to stay in your house, we're going to eat your food, that whole thing. And so they put in the Third Amendment that you couldn't do that with the soldiers. But he felt as the leader, what he did symbolically mattered. And so he stayed in these really dumpy, rundown rooming houses. It showed his level of humility. He could have stayed with people of great wealth. It wouldn't have even put them out. But he didn't like the optics of that. And so that was the Third Amendment. The Fourth Amendment protected people against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth, due process, eminent domain, our rights in criminal cases. Sixth Amendment, right to a speedy trial. Seventh, jury trial in civil lawsuits. Eighth was prohibits excessive bail, fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. The ninth was unenumerated rights retained by the people. So in other words, just because they didn't put something in an amendment saying the people had that right, they still held rights that weren't stated specifically, which was really smart. And then the 10th Amendment was powers reserved to the states or the people. So those were the 10 amendments that are known as the Bill of Rights. Now think about the 10 Commandments. It's interesting, they went from 17 to 12 to 10. There's some symbolism with that. The 10 Commandments, the first 4 things have to do with our duties to God. No other gods before me, shall not make idols, shall not misuse the name of the Lord, and remember the Sabbath. Those are the first 4, right? And then in the 10 Commandments, 5 through 10 are all about how we relate to others. So honor mom and dad, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't give false testimony, and number 10, don't covet anything that belongs to others. So that's how the 10 Commandments break down. Then there's the Beatitudes. These are Jesus' commandments. Now, I wish Jesus had done 10. It would have fit more nicely with my 10, 10, 10. But unfortunately, Jesus did his own thing and he only did 8. So there are 8 Beatitudes. The first was, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Second was, blessed are those who mourn, they shall be comforted. Third is the meek, and they shall inherit the earth. The fourth, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Fifth is, blessed are the merciful. Sixth is, blessed are the pure in heart. Seventh, blessed are the peacemakers. And 8 are, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What strikes me about this is that in the Bill of Rights, the 10 Commandments, and the Beatitudes all begin with humanity's relationship to God. Think about that. The first thing in the Bill of Rights is this freedom of religion, free to relate to God and to worship as one sees fit, or not at all if one sees it that way. The first thing in the 10 Commandments is about God. No other gods before me. The first thing that Jesus talks about in the Beatitudes is, whose is the kingdom of heaven? It's the poor in spirit. So we're dealing in all 3 of these grand documents with things beyond our present situation, our present government, things that go beyond. Yet despite these rights, these amendments, these commandments, an individual's relationship with God remains a personal choice. One of the key things you walk away with in these is there is no force in religion. We read from Mark 10 this morning, and it's a story of a rich man who comes to Jesus, and he says, what shall I do to inherit the kingdom? And he basically Jesus tells this rich man, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. And he says, I can't do that. But what's interesting is Jesus doesn't force him to do it. Think about that. He gets really sad in Mark's account of this answer Jesus gave, and his face got long, and you know what he did? He walked away. Think about Jesus. He could have struck him dead, right? He could have been like, okay, ba-bam, with a big lightning bolt. You're done. Or he could have said, sure, walk away, but I'm going to curse you. Your life will be terrible. You'll lose all your riches and you'll be eaten by fleas the rest of your life, right? We don't want that. So he doesn't do that. He gives this man a choice. Same thing in Deuteronomy. In this passage from Deuteronomy, Moses is with the people. They've been 40 years in the wilderness, and they're about to go into the promised land. And he basically says, you're going to have choices in this new land. You're going to have opportunities for prosperity. And if you choose to walk in obedience to God and keep his commands, you will be blessed. But if you choose to be selfish and disobedient, you will not prosper. And so he gives them that choice. He sends them in, not saying we're going to legislate and mandate this is how you must behave. Likewise, when we think about the colonists, the third group of people, they had been wandering in the wilderness for many years under British rule. They had been wandering in the wilderness, struggling for that independence. Yet now they were embarking on what they called a grand experiment of self-government in a new land. The new nation, think about the opportunity there. Abundant land, coast that went clear from Maine all the way down into the south. I think it ended at Georgia because I think Florida was still owned by a foreign power at that time. But massive amount of coast compared to what European powers had in terms of coastland. And then when you think about westward expansion, they didn't even know quite what the edge was yet. All that agricultural land, all those mineral resources, all those seas. The opportunity for prosperity was off the charts. But the founding fathers, they knew there would be a temptation for selfish behavior. They needed the people, in many ways, to adhere to a moral or religious code. Yet Moses and Jesus and James Madison knew the stubbornness of man. They knew they could not force such morality down the people's throats. They could not force the governed to behave in certain ethical ways. Madison, in his address to the Virginia Conference some years earlier, wrote, "Because we hold it a fundamental and undeniable truth that religion or the duty which we owe our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence." Do you understand what he's saying? He's saying, while this is of the utmost importance, we cannot jam it down people's throat. It has to come from within. It has to be an internal thing rather than an external thing. The religion of every man and woman must be left to their conviction and conscience, and the right of every person to exercise it may be as they dictate. So Madison proposed 4 ideas in Virginia. The first and the most probably important one, no force in religion. This has been a core Brethren belief since 1708. Secondly, toleration in the exercise of religion. Third, dictates of individual conscience shall be respected and protected. If you have a conscientious objection to war, that is honored. That is okay. You can object to what the government is doing. Now, they may require you to do an alternate service or some type of other thing, but you have that ability to object with your conscience. And the fourth thing Madison put forth was a duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. These were the ideas that he fought for in Virginia that would become the foundation of the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. So what was it about Madison, the man, that made him so doggedly focused on the separation of church and state? Well, Madison was born in Virginia in the Anglican Christian tradition. And while many of the early settlers had left their old countries because of religious persecution, in Virginia, religious persecution was running rampant. It's sort of ironic, right? So many people left the old world to go for this religious freedom, and yet they get to Virginia and the Anglicans are running with an iron fist, right? And so, according to researchers and historians, There was religious persecution against Congregationalists, Baptists, Catholics, all kinds of different folks, Presbyterians. And so Madison grows up in this environment. He's in the dominant religion, and yet he's seeing, at least as a kid, and how much do you process as a kid or young adult? You're seeing it, but you're not quite fully comprehending it or processing it. But he goes off to what would later become Princeton. And he does theological education. And Princeton was a Presbyterian university. It was called the College of New Jersey at that point. But during that time in New Jersey, he began to see a much broader view of Christianity. And when he returned to Virginia, he saw, quote, well-meaning men of non-Anglican views being fined or imprisoned for unauthorized meetings. He caught wind of anti-Catholic Pope nights where likenesses of the Pope were burned in effigy. And the final flashpoint was a bill Patrick Henry introduced in the Virginia legislature in 1784 that would have created a property tax on all people to fund the salaries of Christian ministers and teachers. James Madison had had enough. Now here's a guy who's Christian, right? And yet he's saying, this goes too far. This is not what we are about. He acknowledged, Madison, that religion reinforces moral and ethical conduct. But he warns that any state-sponsored religion runs the risk of trampling individual rights. Specifically, in a letter to William Bradford on the subject, he writes, quote, if the Church of England had been the established and general religion in all the northern colonies, and he's writing from Virginia, it is clear to me that slavery and subjection would have been gradually insinuated upon us. Union of religious sentiments begets a surprising confidence, and ecclesiastical establishments tend to great ignorance and corruption, all of which facilitate the execution of mischievous projects. Those are some big words right there, right? Man. Union of religious sentiment begets a surprising confidence, and ecclesiastical establishments tend to great ignorance and corruption. So in other words, what he's saying is, when the state begins to have the moral stamp of approval from religion that is divine from God, they begin to trample all kinds of people and other things. They began to go into great corruption and ignorance and what he calls mischievous projects. One only needs to fast forward to Germany 150 years later to see how the church could be co-opted into evil acts of the state. Now those words sound good from Madison, right? He's talking about how if such things had happened, the North would hold slaves too, as if he is somehow against slavery. And so here we have to kind of be honest about James Madison in his personal conduct. Despite Madison's public condemnation of slavery as a moral evil, Madison held more than 100 slaves on his Mount Pillier plantation. And unlike George Washington, who released all his slaves upon his death, Madison did no such things. The slaves went on to his wife Dolly Madison, and she did with them as she pleased. Madison was also the architect of the deplorable 3/5 compromise of the Constitutional Convention, considering blacks 3/5 of a person. During his time as Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson and as our 4th president, Madison brought slaves to Washington to serve his personal effects. In the early 1800s, Madison proposed two things with slaves: either send them back to Africa, to Liberia, or diffuse them out into the West. He thought that would somehow water down this horrific atrocity known as slavery. So neither solution was a particularly high-minded, good solution. So while the documents this country was founded upon had grandiose language about liberty and equality, the Declaration of Independence proclaims all men are created equal, and that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were unalienable rights. The preamble of the Constitution begins, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity. Yet no such rights were extended to the enslaved, as they were considered property. It wouldn't be until the 13th and 14th Amendments in 1865 and 1866 that the words of the Constitution would apply to the enslaved. The rights of our founding documents were also not extended to Native people or to women. The Native people who had been on the land long before the colonists arrived, they were either massacred, displaced, or forced to assimilate. Right here in Ohio, in the Moravian Massacre, these were pacifists, right? In 1782. And the militiamen came in, they bound the natives who didn't put up any resistance, led them into 2 slaughterhouses, and systematically bludgeoned them to death with heavy mallets before scalping them. The victims included 28 men, 29 women, and 39 children. The militia then piled the bodies inside the buildings, plundered their properties, and burned the entire village to the ground. Only 2 young boys managed to survive the attack and escape to tell the story. Such horrific behavior was not a first here in the United States. If we go back to Deuteronomy, to what Paul Harvey would call the rest of the story after Moses' grand speech on the banks of the Jordan, we see an interesting thing. Within a month after entering the promised land, they charged straight into Jericho and took the city. They destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, children, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. They took the silver and the gold and burned the whole city and everything in it. After Jericho, they turned their attention to other groups on the land: the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Jerkishites, and the Amorites. All these native groups in the promised land were either killed, displaced, or forced to assimilate. It is a very, very similar story to what we saw in these United States. It's interesting, in this book I used for the call to worship, it talks about after Moses had prayed for him, Joshua was given a great power and wisdom by the Spirit of God. He conquered 7 nations and 31 kings in the land of Canaan and took possession of the land. But the scripture tells you how he did it. It was not by peaceable means. Think about this. Such actions were taken by people of faith, people who only a few years earlier had been given the 10 Commandments. Now, what was in the 10 Commandments? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Number 6, do not murder. Number 8, do not steal. Number 10, do not covet. That had just happened. And yet, then they go into the promised land and they just do all this murdering, stealing, coveting. Ooh, that looks pretty good. I think I'll take that by force. Later, Jesus offers the Beatitudes. And then what does the church do? It begins to merge with the state in the 300s. And over time, they began to work together to subjugate people, to take their gain, their benefit. As we think about that, that's what happened too in the United States. We passed these great documents, right? And then right away, we weren't living by them. It's a challenge we face. Our documents, our words are our highest ideals, and yet we are fallible as human beings. And so we struggle to meet the moment with them. So how do we reconcile this? Well, the 2 greatest forces on any individual, on any of us sitting here today, are religion and government. Those are the 2 greatest forces on any of us. Both of them have the power to cause incredible good or inflict immeasurable pain. Both have powerful words that serve as guiding principles. We call them commandments, declarations, constitutions, Bill of Rights, beatitudes. Those all sound great. Yet the limitations of our humanity make it difficult to live up to their high ideals. Moses was barely down from Mount Sinai with those 10 commandments, and the people were back to worshiping false idols, stealing, murdering, committing adultery. Jesus offered the Beatitudes, but by the 4th century, the church had fused power with the state. America was founded 250 years ago on lofty ideals, yet such rights were never afforded to slaves, women, or native people. Yet the separation of church and state puts a check on the immense power that each one holds, both the government and the church. At its best, the church serves as a prophetic moral compass when the state loses its way. When slavery is permitted or natives are being slaughtered, the religious must voice their conscientious objection. Likewise, when a particular religious sect or cult abuses the people or takes violent acts, the state can step in to stop that. So while it may seem counterintuitive for people of faith like us to stand with Madison, to oppose Christian funding for ministers or teachers, it was and it remains necessary. It may seem counterintuitive for George Washington to oppose Pope Nights when the Pope had abused his power, yet state-sanctioned religious persecutions could not be tolerated. Our founding fathers, with all their wisdom, also lived hypocritical personal lives. They seemed to know as individuals that we need guardrails from both the law and the faith. Many of them lived, if your parents have ever said this, do as I say, not as I do. Have you ever heard that? When you call out a contradiction in one of your parents, do as I say, not as I do. That might be a good thing to remember from the founding fathers. Remember what they put in those documents. Don't look at the fact that they did certain things that didn't live up to those documents. Perhaps, though, they did that for a reason. Perhaps they seem to know that as individuals, we need guardrails in our lives for both acts of law and acts of faith. And if we lose one or the other, we are in danger of losing our way. We often think about the genius of the founding fathers is that they put these checks and balances into our legal system, right? And we talk a lot about how, there's the judiciary and the executive branch and the legislative branch. And when this is working perfectly, they all kind of keep each other in check. But I wonder, is the true genius of these documents, of what they put together as the foundation for this country, not in how they parsed the individual parts of the state, but in the fact that they left two entities separate, the church and the state. And maybe the ultimate check on the state is not that the judicial will check the executive or the legislative, but that the church will stand to check the state in totality. Perhaps that is the greatest thing of this. As people of the Christian faith gathered here today, we have a religious responsibility to live by the 10 Commandments and to live by Jesus' Beatitudes. But we also have a responsibility as citizens of this nation to uphold the ideals we find in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. For the more we live out our duties as both citizens and disciples, the closer we come to the life and the prosperity we all seek together. Amen.
Amen.
What's our closing here, Eric?
Take my life.
All right. What number is that? 380 something?
389.